First story, The Grey Soldier, Korea, 1951. It was the winter of 1951, during my second tour in Korea. I was stationed at a forward operating base near the 38th parallel, serving as a military police officer overseeing prisoner processing. The Korean winter was brutal, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you forget what warmth feels like. Most nights I'd wrap myself in whatever I could find, just to keep from freezing to death, dreaming of Alabama summers back, home. We were processing a lot of prisoners those days, mostly North Korean soldiers who surrendered or were captured during skirmishes. The procedure was pretty standard. Search them, document them, put them in holding cells until intelligence officers could question them. January 17th started like any other day, except for the unusual radio chatter about a special prisoner being brought in. I didn't think much of it at the time. Special prisoner usually meant someone with potential intelligence value, maybe an officer or someone who might know troop movements. But when the jeep pulled up and they brought him in, I knew immediately something was very wrong. The prisoner was escorted by 4 soldiers, all of them visibly uncomfortable, keeping an unusual distance from him. He was dressed in what appeared to be a North Korean uniform, but it didn't quite fit right. Too loose in some places, too tight in others. But it wasn't the uniform that caught my attention. It was his skin. An ashen gray color, unlike anything I'd ever seen on a human being. My first thought was frostbite or some kind of battlefield illness, but this was different. The gray wasn't patchy or localized. It was his entire visible skin tone, uniform in color from his hands to his face. They brought him directly to the processing area where I was stationed. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Wilson, pulled me aside before I could begin the standard procedure. "Marshal," he said in a low voice, "this one goes straight to isolation. No processing, no documentation. This prisoner doesn't exist officially. Understand?" I nodded, though I didn't understand at all. The military had protocols for everything, and skipping prisoner documentation wasn't just unusual. It was against every regulation I knew. As the prisoner was led past me, I got my first good look at his face. His eyes were what disturbed me most, completely black, not just the iris, but the entire visible part of the eye, like looking into 2 small pools of oil. There was no white at all. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When those eyes met mine, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Korean winter. It was as if something ancient and completely alien was examining me, categorizing me like a scientist might study a curious insect. His facial features were mostly human, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but there was something subtly wrong about their arrangement. The proportions were slightly off, the angles of his face not quite right. His movements as they led him away were too fluid, too precise, lacking the natural awkwardness of human motion. No shuffling, no hesitation, just perfect, deliberate movement. They took him to our most secure holding cell, a small concrete room with a single heavy door and no windows. It was originally designed to hold high-value prisoners or those deemed at risk of suicide. I was stationed outside as guard while Lieutenant Wilson and a man in civilian clothes I'd never seen before entered the cell with the prisoner. What happened next, I could only hear through the thick door. They attempted to communicate with him, but the sounds that came back weren't any language I recognized, nor did they sound like any human speech I'd ever heard. The interrogation lasted about 20 minutes, though calling it that seems wrong. It was more like they were attempting first contact with something completely foreign. The civilian kept asking basic questions: name, rank, unit, while the prisoner responded with sounds that made my skin crawl. The best way I can describe it is like someone trying to recreate human speech without understanding how our vocal cords work. Clicking, humming, and tones that seem to shift in impossible ways. At one point, the sounds became so disturbing that I found myself pressing my hands against my ears. There was something about those vocalizations that felt wrong on a fundamental level, like they were violating some basic rule of sound itself. After those 20 minutes, Lieutenant Wilson and the civilian emerged, both visibly shaken. The civilian was pale and sweating despite the cold, and Wilson looked like he'd aged 10 years in that short time. "No one goes in there," Wilson ordered. "Me. No one. Not even if you hear anything. You stand guard until relieved. Is that clear?" I nodded, trying to mask my growing fear. What had they seen or heard in there that had affected them so dramatically? As they walked away, I overheard the civilian saying something about calling Washington immediately and "not human" before they were out of earshot. I stood guard alone in that corridor for the next 4 hours, listening. For the first hour, there was nothing but silence from the cell. Then, around hour 2, it started. A low humming that seemed to come not just from the cell, but from the walls around me, from the floor beneath my feet, even from the air itself. It wasn't loud, but it was pervasive, like the entire building was vibrating at some frequency just at the edge of human hearing. My fillings ached, and I developed a splitting headache that made it hard to focus. The humming would stop abruptly, then start again a few minutes later, each time slightly different in pitch or intensity. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was some form of communication, or perhaps a test, seeing what frequencies affected me, measuring my reactions. By hour 3, the situation deteriorated rapidly. I started hearing whispers coming from inside the cell. Not in any language, but somehow I could feel meanings trying to form in my mind. It was like someone was trying to plant thoughts directly into my consciousness, bypassing language altogether. I kept getting fragmented impressions, stars, vast distances, something about time being different. My nose started bleeding without warning, a steady trickle that wouldn't stop no matter how much pressure I applied. The logical part of my brain told me to get help, to call for a medic or at least alert someone, but I couldn't bring myself to leave my post. I was terrified, yes, but also curious in a way that felt unnatural, like that curiosity wasn't entirely my own. I found myself leaning closer to the door, straining to make out more of those whispers, even as another part of me was screaming to run. The corridor began to feel wrong. The dimensions seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. The hallway would seem longer when viewed from the corner of my eye, then snap back to normal when I turned my head. The colors around me began to change too. Muted grays and browns taking on faint purple and green undertones that shouldn't have been possible in the stark military lighting. I checked my watch, needing to ground myself in something concrete, only to find that the hands were spinning rapidly in opposite directions. When I looked up again, I noticed what appeared to be condensation forming on the walls around the cell door, except it wasn't dripping down as it should have. Instead, the droplets were moving horizontally, then upward, defying gravity in a way that made my already pounding head spin. I reached out to touch one of the droplets and pulled my hand back immediately. It wasn't water, but something viscous and warm that left a slight burning sensation on my fingertip. The sound changed again around hour 4, from humming to what I can only describe as a rhythmic pattern of clicks and low-frequency rumbles. The door to the cell began to vibrate in sync with these sounds, and small objects around me, my helmet on the floor, the buttons on my uniform, my dog tags, all trembled as if responding to some force. The air pressure in the corridor dropped, suddenly making my ears pop painfully. I felt a weight on my chest like I was being slowly crushed, and breathing became difficult. That's when I heard the voices of Lieutenant Wilson and several others approaching from around the corner. They were returning with what sounded like heavier security and some kind of equipment. As they came into view, I saw Wilson accompanied by 4 armed guards and 2 men in unmarked black uniforms carrying a large metal case between them. Wilson looked shocked to see me still standing there, blood dried beneath my nose, swaying slightly from the disorientation and headache. "Marshal, you look like hell," he said, but there was more fear than concern in his voice. The men in black didn't acknowledge me at all. They were focused entirely on the cell door and the strange phenomena around it. One of them pulled out what looked like a modified Geiger counter and began taking readings. The device emitted a series of rapid clicks that matched the rhythm coming from inside the cell almost perfectly, causing the technician to step back in alarm. "It's resonating," he said to his colleague, "just like the Arizona incident." This meant nothing to me at the time, but the grave expressions that passed between them made my blood run cold. Wilson ordered me to step aside, then turned to the armed guards. "When we open this door, no one fires unless I give the order. We need it alive. It, not him. It." That single word choice confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Whatever was in that cell wasn't a North Korean soldier. It might not even be human. They opened the door and time seemed to fracture. What I witnessed in those next few moments has haunted me for 70 years, resistant to therapy, medication, and my own desperate attempts to rationalize it away. The cell was empty, or rather, it should have been empty. There was no sign of the gray-skinned prisoner, but the small concrete room had changed. The back wall appeared to be missing, opening into a space that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of our base. Where solid concrete should have been, there was instead what looked like a window into somewhere else entirely. A cavernous chamber with walls of some metallic substance that shifted and rippled like liquid, despite appearing solid. Suspended in the center of this impossible space was what I can only describe as a 3-dimensional geometric pattern of light, pulsing and rotating in ways that hurt to look at directly. It was as if someone had taken a star, compressed it into angular shapes that shouldn't be possible in our reality, and somehow kept it contained. One of the guards immediately vomited. Another began speaking rapidly in what sounded like fluent Russian, despite later swearing he knew not a word of the language. The technician with the Geiger counter was frantically adjusting his device, which was now emitting a continuous high-pitched whine. "It's not a doorway," he was saying, though nobody had suggested it was. "It's more like a thinning. The membrane between, it's communicating with the others." As he spoke, the light pattern seemed to respond, its rotations changing direction and speed. Wilson raised his sidearm, though what he intended to shoot at wasn't clear. The second technician had opened their case and was assembling something that looked like a camera mounted on a tripod, but with components I didn't recognize. He never got to finish. The light pattern suddenly expanded, filling the entire window with blinding brilliance. I shielded my eyes, and when I looked again seconds later, the window was gone. The back wall of the cell was solid concrete once more. The room was completely empty, with no sign of disturbance, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred, except for a strange symbol scorched into the center of the floor that resembled no alphabet or insignia I've ever seen before or since. What followed was a blur of activity that seemed orchestrated, practiced, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The base was suddenly swarming with unfamiliar personnel, men in civilian clothes with hard eyes and efficient movements, speaking in clipped tones and technical jargon. Within 30 minutes, they'd set up a perimeter around the entire detention building, restricting access to all regular military personnel. I was separated from the others who had witnessed the event and taken to a small office where a man who introduced himself only as Dr. Weiss examined me thoroughly. He checked my eyes with a pen light, measured my pulse, took multiple blood samples, and asked a series of increasingly bizarre questions. Had I experienced any missing time? Did I notice any unusual marks on my body? Had I heard any voices giving me specific instructions? Was I having thoughts that felt foreign or implanted? Throughout the examination, I noticed he wore thick rubber gloves and kept his distance from me as much as possible, as if I were contaminated with something contagious. When he drew blood, he handled the vials with extreme caution, immediately sealing them in metal containers. The entire time, I could hear sounds of heavy equipment being moved into the detention building, along with the voices of men giving orders and what sounded like concrete being drilled or cut. Dr. Weiss must have noticed my attention drifting to these sounds because he abruptly increased the volume on a small radio he had brought with him, filling the room with static and Doris Day singing "Too Marvelous for Words" at an uncomfortably loud volume. When I asked what was happening, what that thing in the cell had been, he simply said, "You're suffering from extreme stress and possible hallucinations due to combat fatigue, Corporal Marshall. We're going to help you." His eyes never met mine, as he spoke, focused instead on taking notes that seemed far too extensive for the simple explanation he was offering. Hours later, long after midnight, I found myself in a debriefing room with Lieutenant Wilson, the two guards who hadn't collapsed, and the technicians. Conspicuously absent were the guard who had spoken Russian and the one who had vomited. No one would tell me where they were, though I overheard one of the civilian agents mention quarantine protocols when he thought no one was listening. We were seated at a long table facing three men who never introduced themselves. The one, in the center, older than the others with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, did most of the talking. "What you witnessed today did not happen," he began without preamble. "There was no prisoner with gray skin. There was no anomaly in the cell. What occurred was a gas leak that caused mass hallucinations, followed by an electrical fire that has since been contained." He spoke with such authority that for a brief, disorienting moment I almost believed him, almost questioned my own memories. Then I noticed the symbol, the same one that had been scorched into the cell floor, was now etched into the skin of my wrist like a brand, though I had no memory of how it got there. I instinctively covered it with my hand, suddenly certain that showing it to these men would be dangerous. The silver-haired man continued, explaining that we would all be given mandatory medical leave, with specific physicians assigned to our care. We would be receiving regular treatments to deal with our exposure to the gas leak. We were not under any circumstances to discuss what we thought we had seen with anyone. Not family, not friends, not clergy, not even with each other. Violation of this order would constitute treason. This isn't just about national security, the man said, his voice softening slightly for the first time. This is about the very fabric of reality as our society understands it. Not everyone can handle that kind of paradigm shift. People aren't ready. He paused, studying each of our faces. Some of you may experience ongoing effects, nightmares, unusual perceptions, possibly auditory or visual phenomena that cannot be readily explained. Report these immediately to your assigned physician. Do not attempt to interpret these experiences on your own. They kept us at the base for another week, in a separate building away from other personnel. Each day brought more medical tests, more psychological evaluations, more debriefings that felt more like interrogations. I noticed that our group kept getting smaller. First, the technicians disappeared, then one of the guards. No explanations were offered. Lieutenant Wilson and I were the only ones left by the end of the week. He had changed dramatically in those few days. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, and he developed a slight tremor in his right hand. He mostly avoided me, but the night before we were scheduled to be released, he came to my quarters looking haggard and desperate. "Marshal," he whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "You need to know something. This wasn't the first. There have been others. Roswell, obviously, but also incidents in Arizona, Norway, and Chile. They're not invading. They're already here, have been for a long time. They're studying us." His eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated. That wasn't a North Korean in that cell. It was one of them, but something went wrong with its disguise, its skin. They usually look just like us. Could be anyone. Could be your neighbor, your doctor, could be... He stopped abruptly, staring at something over my shoulder, though when I turned, there was nothing there. "They're watching me now," he whispered, "listening. They put something in my head during the examinations. I can feel it moving sometimes." Before I could respond, he pressed a small journal into my hands. "I've been writing everything down, what I saw in that cell before you came on duty, what the thing said to me. Take this, hide it. If anything happens to me, get it somewhere safe." By morning, Wilson was gone. The men in suits told me he had been transferred to a facility in New Mexico for specialized treatment. I never saw him again, though I did search for him after my discharge. According to all official records, Lieutenant Thomas Wilson had never served in Korea. The journal he gave me contained page after page of the same strange symbols that had appeared on the cell floor, interspersed with fragments of English text that made little sense, coordinates, mathematical formulas, and repeated references to something called the convergence of membranes. I was released from the base in March 1951 with an honorable discharge for medical reasons and strict orders to report to a Dr. Levine in Baltimore twice monthly. They relocated me from my hometown in Alabama to a small apartment in Maryland, providing a modest stipend and a position as a filing clerk for a government contractor. On paper, it looked like they were taking care of a veteran. In reality, I understood I was being kept where they could monitor me. The first few months were the hardest. The symbol on my wrist would periodically burn like a fresh brand, always at night, always at precisely 3:17 a.m. I would wake to find myself standing at my window, staring at the sky without any memory of getting out of bed. I began experiencing episodes of slippage, moments where reality seemed to thin, just like that concrete wall had in Korea. I would be walking down a street in Baltimore, and suddenly the buildings around me would appear transparent, revealing impossible geometries behind them. These episodes never lasted more than a few seconds, but they left me disoriented for hours afterward. Worse were the dreams, vivid, consistent nightmares where I would find myself in vast chambers, similar to what I had glimpsed through the cell wall. In these dreams, I was laid out on a surface that felt neither solid nor liquid, surrounded by figures I could never quite see directly. They communicated through colors and vibrations that somehow formed coherent thoughts in my mind. They were curious about us, yes, but not in any way I found comforting. It was the cold curiosity of entities trying to understand why ants build their hills in certain patterns, academic interest without empathy or moral consideration. I faithfully attended my appointments with Dr. Levine, though I quickly realized these sessions weren't therapeutic but investigative. He was less interested in helping me cope than in documenting every detail of my ongoing experiences. He recorded everything, administered strange tests involving geometric patterns and color recognition, and regularly took blood samples. Once, when I arrived for an appointment, I found another patient leaving, a man with the same haunted expression I saw in my mirror every morning. When our eyes met, I felt an immediate connection, a recognition. Before either of us could speak, two men in suits appeared and escorted him away. Dr. Levine was unusually agitated that day, asking repeatedly if the other patient had spoken to me. I lied and said no, but I had noticed something as the man passed. A familiar symbol partially visible on his wrist beneath his watch. By late 1952, I had begun my own investigation carefully and quietly. Wilson's journal became my guide, though deciphering it was maddening work. Much of it seemed like nonsense, the ravings of a traumatized mind, but certain passages contained verifiable information, names, locations, dates that checked out when I researched them. I created a web of string and newspaper clippings on my apartment wall, hidden behind a large map that I could quickly pull down if anyone visited. I tracked similar incidents, unexplained disappearances, witnesses describing beings with gray skin, localized equipment failures, and reports of strange aerial phenomena. A pattern emerged, not just geographically but temporally. These events seemed to cluster around specific dates, appearing in cycles I couldn't quite pin down. I made contact with a journalist in Arizona who had investigated a similar incident from 1949 that Wilson had mentioned. 2 days before we were scheduled to meet, he died in what was ruled a single-car accident. The police report noted that his vehicle had been subjected to extreme heat that melted much of the interior without causing a fire. I received a phone call that same day. No one spoke, but I heard that same rhythmic pattern of clicks and low-frequency rumbles I'd heard outside the cell in Korea. I abandoned my apartment that night, taking only Wilson's journal and my own notes. For the next several months, I moved frequently using cash, staying in roadside motels and boarding houses. I noticed signs of surveillance, the same cars appearing too often, men in public places watching a little too intently, my motel, rooms showing subtle signs of being searched when I returned to them. During this period, the physical symptoms intensified. The symbol on my wrist began to change, the lines rearranging themselves into new configurations every few days. I developed an extreme sensitivity to certain frequencies. Household appliances, car engines, even some human voices would trigger debilitating migraines that left me incapacitated. Most disturbing was what happened when I was near electrical storms. The air around me would take on a purple hue, and I could see patterns in the lightning that conveyed information, complex mathematical concepts that I somehow understood despite having no advanced education in the subject. I began working through calculations in Wilson's journal that had previously seemed like gibberish, solving equations that related to something the journal called membrane permeability and cross-dimensional access points. In April 1953, everything escalated. I was staying at a boarding house in rural Pennsylvania when I awoke to a familiar humming. My room was filled with a soft blue light that seemed to emanate from the symbol on my wrist, which was now glowing and vibrating against my skin. Outside my window, hovering silently over the field behind the house, was an object I can only describe as a distortion in space. Not a solid craft, but an area where the night sky and stars appeared to bend and fold around a central point of absolute darkness. The air pressure dropped dramatically, creating the same crushing sensation I had experienced in Korea. I tried to move but found myself paralyzed, able only to watch as the distortion grew larger, now filling the entire window. The humming intensified, resonating through my body until I felt like my bones might shatter. Then, with shocking suddenness, there was someone else in the room. I say someone because the figure was humanoid, but this was not the gray-skinned prisoner from Korea. This being was tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso. Its skin had a translucent quality, revealing shadowy suggestions of an internal structure that matched no human anatomy I recognized. Its face was the most human part of it, though still wrong. Eyes set too far apart, no visible nose, just two small slits and a mouth that never moved when it communicated. Because it did communicate, not through sound, but directly into my mind. Observer 53591, it began, the designation apparently referring to me. Your neural patterns have maintained unusual stability following exposure. This is statistically significant. I couldn't respond verbally, still paralyzed, but somehow it perceived my thoughts. Your kind interprets our research as invasion. This is incorrect. We have always been here. We are simply maintaining the membrane. Images flooded my mind. Earth seen from impossible perspectives. Human history witnessed from outside time. Civilizations rising and falling like waves on an ocean shore. I saw strange beings moving among humans throughout history, collecting data, making subtle adjustments to what the entity called reality consensus. Most disturbing were glimpses of facilities, some deep underground, some in remote locations where humans and these entities worked together. I recognized military uniforms, government insignias. In one horrifying flash, I saw Lieutenant Wilson, or what remained of him, his body connected to machines of impossible design, his eyes replaced with devices that recorded everything they perceived, his mouth forming those same clicking sounds I had heard in Korea. The entity continued its one-sided conversation, explaining concepts that my human mind struggled to comprehend. It referred to Earth as a junction point in something called the multiverse membrane, a place where different realities naturally overlap and sometimes bleed into each other. Their species served as maintenance workers, ensuring these overlaps didn't become tears or collapses. The gray-skinned soldier had been one of their kind, a younger, less experienced entity whose containment suit had malfunctioned, revealing its true nature. Your military leadership is aware of our presence, it communicated. An agreement exists. We maintain membrane stability. They receive certain technological insights. The agreement does not include widespread human awareness. As it shared this information, I began to feel a burning sensation spreading from the symbol on my wrist, up my arm, and throughout my body. My blood felt like it was turning to fire in my veins, and I would have screamed if I could have moved my mouth. The entity tilted its head, studying my reaction with what seemed like clinical interest. Your physiological response is unexpected. The membrane marker we placed on you was meant for tracking, not integration. It reached out with impossibly long fingers and touched the symbol on my wrist. Immediately, the burning sensation intensified to unbearable levels. I felt something inside me changing at a molecular level, cells rearranging, neural pathways rewiring. Through the haze of pain, more images flooded my consciousness. Star maps showing routes between worlds, mathematical formulas describing how to bend space and time, glimpses of civilizations on planets orbiting distant suns. The information was overwhelming, too much for a human mind to process. I could feel my consciousness fragmenting under the pressure, memories becoming untethered from their proper contexts. The last thing I remember clearly is the entity withdrawing its hand and communicating one final thought. You are now part of the network, a node in the membrane. This was not the intended outcome, but adaptation is necessary. Your consciousness will serve as a monitoring point until your biological functions cease. Then the pressure in the room suddenly equalized. The distortion outside my window collapsed in on itself, and the entity simply folded away, disappearing not by moving through space, but by somehow stepping sideways out of reality itself. I spent the next 3 weeks in a state of semi-consciousness, drifting between feverish hallucinations and moments of hyperclarity. The elderly woman who ran the boarding house found me the morning after the encounter, unresponsive but with eyes wide open. The symbol on my wrist now expanded into an intricate pattern that covered most of my forearm. She called a local doctor, who diagnosed me with severe nervous exhaustion and recommended rest. If he noticed the strange markings on my arm, he made no mention of it. During those weeks, I experienced what I can only describe as a rewiring of my perception. I began to see the world in layers, the physical reality everyone experiences, overlaid with patterns of energy and information flowing around and through all matter. Electrical systems became visible networks of light. People appeared surrounded by complex fields that shifted with their emotions and thoughts. Most disturbing were the thin spots I could now perceive. Areas where the membrane the entity had described was weakest. Places where that other reality pressed against our own, like a finger pushing against a thin rubber sheet. These spots weren't random. They clustered around certain geological formations, specific buildings, usually government or military, and occasionally individual people. When I finally recovered enough to function, I discovered that men had come looking for me, serious men in dark suits asking questions about the veteran staying upstairs. The boarding house owner, perhaps out of kindness or perhaps due to a natural distrust of authority, had claimed I had checked out weeks earlier. I left that night, abandoning most of my possessions yet again, and began a nomadic existence that has continued with brief interruptions to this day. I learned to hide my awareness, to pretend I didn't see the weak points in reality, or the occasionally glimpsed entities that moved through them. I discovered that certain materials could block my enhanced perception. Lead worked best, creating a temporary relief from the constant awareness of that other reality pressing against ours. I fashioned a crude bracelet of lead that covered the symbol on my wrist, which provided some protection against being tracked. Without it, they could find me. Not just the government agents who continued to search for me, but the entities themselves, drawn to the node I had unwillingly become. Most critically, I learned that I wasn't alone. Over the decades, I've encountered others like me, people who had experienced contact and been changed by it. Some were military personnel like myself, others civilians who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. We recognized each other instantly, a mutual awareness that transcended normal human perception. We never organized formally. That would have been too dangerous. But we shared information, warnings, and the comfort of knowing we weren't insane. It's been 70 years since Korea, since that gray-skinned prisoner who wasn't a prisoner at all changed the course of my life. I'm an old man now, and the doctors tell me I don't have much time left. Perhaps that's why I'm finally sharing this story, typing it with arthritic fingers in this online forum where people share experiences most of the world dismisses as delusion or fantasy. The symbol on my wrist has continued to evolve over the decades, becoming more complex, occasionally causing episodes where information floods my consciousness. Technical schematics, astronomical data, warnings about particular locations I should avoid. I've lived a life on the margins, working odd jobs that paid in cash, using different names, moving whenever I sensed they were getting close again. The last direct contact I had with one of the entities was in 1977, during the New York blackout. The power failure wasn't an infrastructure issue as reported. It was caused by their massive presence in the area. Something critical was happening with the membrane, a potential tear that required immediate intervention. I saw dozens of them moving openly through the darkened streets, visible to me, but apparently invisible to most others. One approached me directly, communicating that my node function had provided valuable data and that my biological vessel had lasted longer than expected. It informed me that when my physical form expired, the connection would transfer to another suitable candidate, possibly one of my descendants, though I've never had children precisely to prevent this. Since then, the government's interest in me seems to have waned, perhaps because they have newer, more valuable sources of information. But I still take precautions. Even as I type this, I'm using a public library computer in a town where I've lived less than a month, and I'll be moving on tomorrow. I don't expect most people to believe this account. It sounds like the ravings of a paranoid mind, I know. But I'm not writing this for the skeptics. I'm writing for those who have seen something they can't explain, who have experienced moments where reality seemed to thin or shift, who have encountered something impossible and been forever changed by it. They're still here among us, both the entities and the government agencies that work with them. The agreement continues. The maintenance of our reality continues. And the weak points in the membrane are growing more numerous. I've watched them increase decade by decade, clustering around new technologies, expanding near certain population centers. Whatever is coming, it's accelerating. I won't live to see the culmination, and perhaps that's a mercy. This will likely be my only post here. If men in suits start asking questions in your online community about this account, or if you notice unusual interest from government IP addresses, I suggest you delete it immediately. To anyone who recognizes their own experience in what I've described, you're not alone, but be careful who you trust. The symbol finds its way to those who can serve as nodes. Watch for it. And if you ever encounter a person whose skin seems just slightly the wrong color, whose movements are too fluid to be natural, whose eyes seem to absorb light rather than reflect it, walk away. Don't report it, don't investigate it, just walk away. They're not here to invade. They've always been here. We're living in their maintenance zone, and some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Second story. The Echo Base Incident, Afghanistan, 2009. I've been putting this off for years, but I need to tell someone what happened to me at Outpost Echo in Afghanistan back in 2009. I was stationed there with 23 other soldiers, standard, remote monitoring position in Kandahar province. Nothing special about it except how isolated we were. The outpost sat in this valley, surrounded by jagged mountains, and at night the stars looked impossibly bright, without any light pollution. April 15th, 2009 started like any other day. I remember it was unusually hot, even for Afghanistan in spring. The thermometer at the command post read 102 degrees by 10 a.m., and the air had this weird electric quality to it, like right before a massive thunderstorm. I was on comms duty that morning, monitoring radio chatter and sending our routine status reports to command. Everything was normal. A few reports of insurgent movement several miles east, but nothing concerning for our position. Around noon, Staff Sergeant Miller noticed something odd on our perimeter sensors. They kept glitching out, showing movement, and then nothing, in a perfectly timed pattern that didn't make any sense. We ran diagnostics 3 times, but couldn't find anything wrong with the system. Sergeant Hayes sent out a 2-man patrol to check the perimeter physically, standard procedure, but they reported back that everything looked clear. That's when the radios started acting up too. First, there was this low humming sound that would come and go, then complete static, then crystal clear for a few minutes before dropping out entirely. By 1400 hours, we couldn't reach command at all. The satellite phone wouldn't connect either. We were completely cut off, which had never happened before, not even during the worst sandstorms. As the day wore on, everyone was on edge. I remember watching Specialist Garcia nervously cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time in an hour. Chapman, our medic, kept complaining about a headache that wouldn't go away no matter how many pills he took. Even Miller, who'd been through 3 tours and never showed a hint of anxiety, kept pacing around the command post, checking the comms equipment over and over. Around 1700 hours, the sky began to change. It's hard to describe, but the blue seemed to deepen, becoming almost purple in places. The clouds moved in unnatural patterns, swirling in tight circles directly above our outpost. I remember Rivera pointing up, saying something in Spanish that I couldn't understand, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. The temperature dropped about 20 degrees in minutes. That's when we heard it, this low-frequency sound that you felt more than heard, vibrating through your chest, your teeth, your skull. One of the new guys, Johnson I think, started bleeding from his nose and ears. Chapman was trying to help him when the lights appeared. They weren't like normal aircraft lights or flares. They moved in ways that defied physics, accelerating instantly, making sharp 90-degree turns, hovering perfectly still, then blinking out only to reappear somewhere else. Lieutenant Ross ordered everyone to battle stations, but what the hell were we supposed to be shooting at? I grabbed my M4 and night vision goggles and headed to my assigned defensive position at the north wall. Through the NVGs, I could see something disturbing the air above us, like heat waves but more structured, geometric almost, creating these weird distortions in the atmosphere. The sound intensified until I could barely think straight. My vision started warping, the edges tunneling inward, and my entire body felt like it was vibrating at a cellular level. Something warm trickled down from my ear. Blood, just like Johnson. The other guys were shouting, but their voices sounded distant and distorted, like they were underwater. Then came the light, not from above like I expected, but from everywhere at once. Blindingly white, it seemed to pass through solid objects, including the concrete walls of our outpost. I couldn't move. Not paralyzed exactly, but like my brain had forgotten how to communicate with my muscles. I watched, helpless, as everything around me was bathed in this impossible light that cast no shadows. My watch stopped at exactly 1743. Time itself seemed to fracture. I perceived everything in slow-motion fragments. Hayes dropping to his knees, eyes wide and unblinking. Miller firing his weapon into the air until it clicked empty. The coffee in Lieutenant Ross's mug floating upward, defying gravity. The strangest part was the silence that suddenly fell. The humming stopped. The shouting stopped. Even the air became completely still. In that moment of perfect, unnatural quiet, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible, like the entire universe had paused to take a breath. Then I was moving upward, not walking or climbing, but rising, as if the gravity beneath me had reversed. The last thing I remember seeing was the outpost getting smaller below me, all our vehicles, equipment, and weapons left exactly where they were. Then nothing but whiteness and a sensation of tremendous speed. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I became aware again, I was lying on something hard and smooth. Not metal, not plastic, but something that felt almost organic, with a slight give to it like cartilage. The surface seemed to regulate temperature. It wasn't cold or warm, just neutral. The light was different now, a pale blue-white that seemed to come from the walls themselves, with no visible source. I tried to move but couldn't. Again, not like being strapped down. There were no restraints I could see, but like my body simply refused to respond to my commands. I could blink and breathe, that was it. The room, if you could call it that, had no corners, just a continuous curved surface that flowed from wall to ceiling to floor. No doors that I could see, no windows, nothing that looked like technology as we understand it. Just smooth, slightly iridescent surfaces that occasionally rippled like disturbed water. The air felt thick, almost pressurized, and had a faint, metallic taste that made my tongue tingle. My hearing was muffled, like being underwater, but I could detect a rhythmic pulsing sound that might have been machinery or could have been biological. It was impossible to tell. What scared me most in those first moments wasn't where I was, but how calm I felt. Despite the absolute horror of my situation, some external force seemed to be suppressing my panic response. My heart rate remained steady. My breathing stayed. Even, it wasn't natural. The rational part of my brain was screaming in terror while my body remained perfectly serene. I've never experienced a disconnect like that before or since. They entered the room without warning. One moment I was alone, the next they were there. 3 of them. They didn't come through any door. They just appeared, like reality glitched, and suddenly included them. They weren't the little gray figures from pop culture. These beings were tall, maybe 7 feet, and unnervingly thin, with limbs that seemed too long and jointed in unusual places. Their skin wasn't gray, but a translucent white that showed shadowy structures moving beneath, like watching organs through frosted glass. Their faces were the worst part. Not oval with large black eyes like in the movies, but almost triangular. with no discernible nose or mouth, just 3 small openings where you'd expect eyes, arranged in a triangle pattern. They moved with unsettling grace, gliding rather than walking, maintaining perfect synchronization with each other like dancers or parts of a single organism. They never touched the floor, hovering a few inches above it. They communicated without sound. I could feel it in my head. Not words exactly, but concepts, images, sensations being planted directly into my consciousness. The sensation was violating in a way I can't adequately describe, like fingers rifling through my memories, pulling them out for examination, then shoving them back in the wrong order. I tried to close my eyes, but one of them moved closer, and suddenly I couldn't blink anymore. It leaned over me, its face inches from mine, those 3 eye openings expanding and contracting like camera apertures. The inside of those openings wasn't dark, but filled with swirling colors I've never seen before or since. Colors that shouldn't exist, that human eyes aren't designed to process. What came next was the examination. A section of the ceiling detached and transformed into a complex array of instruments. Or at least that's how my brain interpreted what I was seeing. I don't think they were physical tools in the way we understand them. They seemed to phase between solid and energy, becoming whatever they needed to be for each specific purpose. The beings never touched me directly. Instead, these tools moved over and sometimes through my body without breaking the skin. I could feel them inside me, scanning, sampling, measuring. The pain was unlike anything I've experienced. It wasn't sharp or burning or any normal pain sensation. It was wrong, like my nerves were being reprogrammed to send signals they were never meant to transmit. My perception of time became completely distorted. What might have been minutes felt like days, then seconds, then years. At one point, I was somehow aware of every cell in my body simultaneously, all 37 trillion of them, each one screaming in its own microscopic voice. During the procedure, images flooded my mind. Star systems I didn't recognize, structures of impossible architecture floating in empty space, creatures that made the beings examining me look positively human by comparison. I don't know if they were showing me these things intentionally, or if I was somehow accessing their memories or knowledge. Throughout it all, they maintained a clinical detachment. There was no cruelty in what they did, no sadism, just cold, methodical curiosity, which somehow made it worse. I wasn't being tortured. I was being catalogued. To them, my suffering registered no more than a bacterium's might to a human scientist, looking through a microscope. After the physical examination came something even more invasive. They went after my mind. One of them placed what I can only describe as a hand, though it had too many digits, moving in ways fingers shouldn't, near my head, never quite touching me. That's when I felt my consciousness being pulled apart, like individual threads of thought being separated for inspection. Memories from my childhood surfaced with perfect clarity. Building sandcastles with my dad at Virginia Beach when I was 6, my 10th birthday party, my first kiss behind the gym in high school. But they weren't just memories anymore. I was reliving them, fully present in those moments while simultaneously aware of lying on that examination table. Then came military memories, basic training, deployment briefings, faces of my fellow soldiers, layouts of bases, weapons, specifications. They seemed particularly interested in how our command structure worked, how orders were given and followed. They extracted knowledge I didn't even know I had. Classified information I'd seen once on a lieutenant's computer screen and forgotten about. Conversations I'd overheard while half asleep on watch. My entire personal history and everything I knew about the US military was being sifted through and categorized. Throughout this mental invasion, images were simultaneously being inserted into my mind, information flowing both ways. I saw star maps with specific systems highlighted, what looked like timelines branching and converging, Earth viewed from space with certain locations marked, including areas in Afghanistan. Most disturbing were the fragments of what seemed like other abductions, other soldiers from other wars across different time periods, some in uniforms I recognized from Wadu, Vietnam, even what looked like Civil War-era clothing. I realized with sickening clarity that whatever was happening to me was part of something much larger and longer running than I could comprehend. They'd been watching us, studying us, for generations, particularly during our conflicts. The mental probing intensified until I could no longer distinguish between my thoughts and the information they were feeding me. Their consciousness began to bleed into mine, and for several terrifying moments, I wasn't entirely myself anymore. I experienced existence from their perspective, and what I felt defies easy description. Their perception of reality was fundamentally different. Time wasn't linear for them, but layered, with past, present, and multiple potential futures, all accessible simultaneously. Their emotional range was alien, not absent as I'd first thought, but operating on frequencies completely foreign to human experience. They felt something akin to curiosity toward us, but mixed with what I can only describe as a cosmic impatience, as if they were teachers dealing with particularly slow students. There was something else too, a sense of urgency regarding Earth, specifically about something buried deep in the Afghan mountains. Whatever they were after, it wasn't us. Humans were incidental, merely in proximity to something else they valued. During this mind meld, I glimpsed fragments of their knowledge, civilizations rising and falling across the galaxy, technologies that manipulated gravity and consciousness as easily as we manipulate wood or metal, the true age of the universe, much older than our scientists believe, and most terrifying, the fate of species that had interfered with their work in the past. None exist anymore, not extinct in the way we understand it, but systematically unmade, erased so thoroughly, it's as if they never evolved in the first place. This glimpse into their capabilities filled me with such profound dread that my human mind began to shut down, unable to process the scale of what I was witnessing. The beings recognized this immediately and withdrew from my consciousness, leaving me gasping and sobbing on the table as my sense of self reassembled itself from scattered fragments. The connection broken, they moved away from me and appeared to confer among themselves. Their movements became more agitated, faster, less synchronized. For the first time, I sensed disagreement between them. Two seemed to be arguing while the third observed. Without their direct mental suppression, terror flooded back into my system. My heart raced, sweat poured from my skin, and my body began to tremble uncontrollably. I realized I could move again, just slightly, fingers and toes, then arms and legs. The restraining force was weakening. Taking advantage of their distraction, I managed to turn my head and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A curved wall of the chamber had become transparent, revealing stars outside. But wrong stars, patterns I didn't recognize with colors that shifted between blues, purples and reds in pulsating rhythms. We weren't just above Afghanistan anymore. We weren't even in Earth's solar system. The realization crushed what little hope I had of escape or rescue. I was farther from home than any human had ever been, with no way to measure the distance. Maybe that's what they were arguing about. How far to take me, whether to return me at all. The third, being suddenly turned toward me, sensing my awareness, and approached. Its triangular face tilted slightly, studying my fear with what felt like clinical interest. Then it extended one of those impossible hands and touched me, the only time any of them made physical contact. The sensation was like being struck by lightning, every nerve firing simultaneously. My vision whited out, and my consciousness exploded into thousands of pieces. In that fragmented state, I received what felt like a direct communication. Not words, not even concepts this time, but pure intention. Watch the skies. We are not finished. Others come. Then darkness consumed me. I regained consciousness, face down in the dirt, disoriented and gasping. The taste of Afghan dust filled my mouth, and the familiar weight of my body felt strange, like wearing clothes that no longer fit right. It was night, the desert cold seeping through my uniform. Stars gleamed overhead, normal stars, Earth stars, and for several minutes I just lay there, sobbing with relief. When I finally managed to push myself up, I realized I was about a mile from our outpost. The base sat below me, fully illuminated by our generators, every light blazing. It looked untouched, peaceful even. I checked my watch. It was still stopped at 17:43. My phone was dead too. I had no idea how long I'd been gone. My body felt wrong, joints aching like I'd aged decades overnight, skin hypersensitive, vision slightly altered with colors appearing more vivid than they should in darkness. I had a pounding headache that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and there was dried blood caked around my ears, nose, and eyes. As I stumbled toward the outpost, I noticed something else. Perfect silence. No radio chatter, no distant voices, no sounds of vehicles or equipment running, despite all the lights being on. Every instinct screamed danger, but I had nowhere else to go. As I approached the perimeter, I called out for the guard who should have been posted at the entrance. No response. I shouted louder, identifying myself, using our protocols for returning patrols. Nothing. With growing dread, I entered the compound, my hand on my sidearm, which I was surprised to find still holstered at my hip. The main gate was open, the guard post empty. The sense of wrongness intensified with each step I took into our base. Everything looked exactly as it had been earlier that day, down to the half-eaten meals in the mess area and equipment left mid-maintenance. But there wasn't a single person anywhere. I searched every building, every bunker, every vehicle. 23 men had vanished without a trace, rifles left leaning against walls, coffee still warm in mugs, cigarettes burned down to stubs in ashtrays. In the command center, all systems were operational, radios receiving nothing but static, surveillance monitors showing empty perimeters, computers humming quietly. I tried sending emergency transmissions on all frequencies, but received no response. The satellite phone was dead. I checked the security footage, rewinding through the digital recordings. There I was at my communications post that morning, then the first anomalies with the perimeter sensors, the patrol returning, the growing unease throughout the day. Then, at precisely 17:43, the cameras captured exactly what I remembered, the strange light, everyone reacting in panic, weapons being fired uselessly. The footage showed all of us simultaneously collapsing, then our bodies rising slowly into the air before disappearing from frame as we were lifted through the ceiling. After that, nothing but empty rooms for hours until I watched myself enter the base alone, searching frantically from building to building. The timestamp on the footage showed I'd been gone for exactly 14 hours. It was now zone 7:43 the next morning, though the sky outside still looked like middle of the night. That's when I noticed something else on the monitors. The perimeter sensors were detecting movement all around the base, closing in from multiple directions. On the thermal imaging cameras, I could see heat signatures approaching, human-sized, moving with military precision. A rescue team, I thought initially, my heart leaping with hope. But why were they approaching so cautiously, weapons raised using cover? Why not just call out on the radio? As they got closer, I could make out their uniforms through the night vision cameras. Not American, not NATO, not Afghan National Army. Something else entirely, wearing gear I didn't recognize, moving with a coordination that seemed almost inhuman. Panic seized me. I grabbed extra ammunition, water, and a field pack with emergency supplies. Whatever was coming, my instincts screamed to avoid capture. I didn't fully understand why, just a bone-deep certainty that being taken by these forces would be worse than what the aliens had done to me. I slipped out through our emergency evacuation tunnel, a narrow passage that led to a concealed exit, 50 meters beyond the perimeter wall. As I emerged onto a rocky slope overlooking the base, I watched as the unknown unit breached our compound with practiced efficiency. They moved differently than any soldiers I'd ever seen, not just well-trained, but almost synchronized like the aliens had been. They swept through our buildings methodically, seemingly unsurprised to find them empty. Within minutes, they began setting up strange equipment, focusing particularly on the spot where the light had first appeared. They were taking readings, collecting samples, photographing everything. This wasn't a rescue operation, it was a scientific examination. I retreated further into the hills, my mind racing. Who were they? Government black ops? Foreign intelligence? Something else entirely? The way they moved, the technology they carried, it didn't match anything in my experience. And I'd worked alongside special forces from multiple countries. A terrible thought occurred to me. What if they were human but changed? What if they were working for our abductors? I'd seen those images of other soldiers from other eras during my mental probing. What happened to those who were returned? Were they studied, recruited, repurposed? As the unknown team continued their work below, a helicopter approached from the east, completely silent, no rotor sound whatsoever, just a dark shape against the stars. It hovered over our base, shining a blue-white light similar to what I'd experienced on the alien craft. That was enough. I turned and fled deeper into the mountains, moving on instinct, driven by terror of what might happen if they found me. I spent 3 days in the mountains, surviving on my emergency rations and moving only at night. The strange, silent helicopters continued to circle the area, sweeping searchlights across the terrain. During daylight, I caught glimpses of ground, teams combing the hillsides, always those same uniformed figures, moving with that unnatural synchronization. They used devices that looked like standard military equipment from a distance, but functioned like nothing I'd ever seen in service. One afternoon, hiding in a narrow crevice, I watched them pass less than 20 feet from my position. Up close, their faces looked human enough. But their eyes, there was something profoundly wrong about them. They didn't blink normally. Their movements were too precise, too economical. They spoke to each other rarely, and when they did, it wasn't in any language I recognized from my linguistic training. My military-issued emergency beacon remained off. Something told me, activating, it would bring these people not actual help. On the fourth day, I encountered an elderly Afghan shepherd in a remote valley. He seemed terrified at first, but when I managed to communicate that I needed help, he reluctantly led me to his village. The people there regarded me with fear and suspicion, keeping their distance and whispering among themselves. Through broken Pashto and gestures, I learned something chilling. According to them, strange lights had been appearing in the sky for generations near certain mountains, always followed by disappearances. They believed the mountains contained doorways to the sky that had been there since before people. Most disturbing was when the village elder, seeing my dog tags, nodded knowingly and said something the shepherd translated roughly as, "The metal men always come back wrong. You have the looking through eyes now." When I asked what he meant, the old man just tapped his own eyes and then pointed to the stars. The villagers helped me reach a main road, where I eventually flagged down a convoy of actual U.S. military vehicles. Their reaction to finding me was illuminating. Initial disbelief, followed by urgent radio calls. Then I was quickly segregated from the regular troops. Within hours, I was in a secure medical facility at Bagram Air Base, surrounded by doctors and intelligence officers. They said I'd been missing for 11 days. The official story was that insurgents had attacked our outpost, captured or killed everyone, and I alone had escaped. But their questions revealed they didn't believe this cover story any more than I did. Why were there no signs of combat at the base? Where were the bodies of my fellow soldiers? How had I survived alone in hostile territory for so long? The debriefings lasted weeks. I told them everything at first. The lights, the abduction, the beings, the examination, the strange team that came after. The intelligence officers' reactions were telling. Not disbelief, but carefully controlled neutrality, like they were comparing my account to others they'd heard. Medical tests showed unexplainable anomalies, unusual brain activity in regions typically dormant in humans. Elevated white blood cell counts, traces of compounds in my bloodstream that the doctors couldn't identify. There were also small, perfectly circular scars behind my ears and at the base of my skull that hadn't been there before, incisions so precise they were nearly invisible. Most disturbing were the X-rays that revealed a small, metallic object lodged at the base of my brainstem. When I asked about removing it, the medical team exchanged glances and said further tests were needed first. They never mentioned it again. After 2 months of questioning and examinations, men in civilian clothes arrived. No military insignia, no identification, just dark suits and credentials that made even the base commander stand at attention. They informed me I was being transferred to a specialized facility for further treatment. I never reached that facility. During transport, our convoy was ambushed on a supposedly secure road. In the chaos, I escaped, though looking back, the attack seemed almost staged, like someone wanted me to get away. I made my way to Pakistan and eventually back to the States using skills I never knew I had and connections that seemed to materialize just when I needed them. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being helped, guided by some unseen hand. I've been living off the grid for 16 years now, moving constantly. The government lists me as AWOL, possibly deceased. My family thinks I died in Afghanistan. It's safer that way, because they're still looking for me. Both groups are. Sometimes I glimpse the suited men in crowds scanning faces. Sometimes I see the other ones, the two perfect soldiers with the wrong eyes. And sometimes, usually around 3 a.m., I wake to find my room bathed in that blue-white light. My body frozen, my mind screaming as the familiar sensation of being watched presses down on me. It never lasts more than a few seconds, but it's enough to remind me they can find me anytime they want. The strangest part is what's happened to my mind. I dream in languages I've never learned. I can solve complex mathematical equations instantly. I sometimes know things I shouldn't, about people, events, places I've never been, and the visions, future events that come to me with perfect clarity, always involving certain locations in Afghanistan and specific astronomical alignments. Whatever they put in my head is still active, still transmitting. My fellow soldiers from Outpost Echo have never been found. No bodies, no evidence, nothing. It's like they never existed. Sometimes I wonder if they're still up there, still being studied, or if they've been repurposed like those strange soldiers I saw. Or maybe they're like me, returned but changed, hiding, watching the skies, waiting for the moment when whatever was set in motion in those mountains finally reveals its purpose. Because that's the most terrifying realization I've come to. This isn't over. The abduction wasn't an isolated event. It was preparation. For what, I don't know. But when I look at the stars now, I don't see beauty anymore. I see a countdown. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story. Third story, The Metal Room, France, 1918-1968. I'm not sure if writing this down will ease the constant disorientation I feel, but at this point I'm willing to try anything. My name is Jean Moreau, and according to everyone around me, I've been missing for 50 years. 50 years that I never lived. The date on the newspapers says it's July 1968, but the last day I remember clearly was March 14th, 1918, during the German spring offensive near Saint-Quentin. I was 23 years old then, and apparently I still am. The doctors have examined me extensively. They say my body shows no signs of aging beyond those 23 years. My fingerprints match military records from 1918. My knowledge of military protocols and daily life from that time is too precise to be fabricated, they say. The French government has kept my case mostly quiet. I understand why. Who would believe that a soldier could vanish from a battlefield in 1918 and reappear in a small village in Normandy in 1968, wearing the same mud-caked uniform, carrying the same Liebel rifle, with the same unhealed shrapnel wound in my left shoulder? I've been told I'm suffering from some form of trauma-induced delusion, but I know what happened to me wasn't human. The metal place they took me to wasn't of this world. I can still smell that sterile electric scent that filled my nostrils like ozone after lightning, but sharper, more artificial. Sometimes at night, I wake up feeling the cold, smooth surface beneath my body, so unlike the muddy trenches I'd grown accustomed to during the war. That day in 1918 had started like many others during that hellish spring. Our company had been positioned at a forward observation post, trying to hold back the German advance as they implemented their new infiltration tactics. The artillery barrage had begun before dawn, the ground shaking so violently that several of our dugouts collapsed. I remember the taste of dirt in my mouth, the deafening explosions that made my ears bleed, and the screams of dying men that somehow cut through it all. Captain Rousseau had ordered us to fall back to the secondary position around 800 hours. The sun was barely visible through the thick smoke and fog. As I ran through the cratered field with my unit, a shell landed about 20 meters to my right. The explosion knocked me off my feet, and I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as shrapnel tore through my uniform. I crawled into a crater for cover, pressing my handkerchief against the wound to slow the bleeding. That's when everything around me went silent. Not the blessed silence of peace, but an unnatural absence of sound that made my skin crawl. The battlefield, which seconds before had been chaos incarnate, suddenly seemed frozen. The smoke hung motionless in the air. A bird, I remember it was a small sparrow, appeared suspended in mid-flight above the crater, in that moment of impossible stillness. The air above me began to shimmer, like heat rising from summer pavement, but with a bluish tint that cast strange shadows across the crater walls. The light intensified until it was almost blinding. I tried to shield my eyes with my arm, but I couldn't move. My entire body felt paralyzed, though strangely I felt no fear, just a profound confusion and the distant understanding that something beyond my comprehension was happening. I felt myself being lifted, not roughly like when stretcher bearers grab a wounded soldier, but smoothly, as if gravity itself had reversed its pull on me. My body rose from the mud, suspended in that blue light, and then everything went dark. When consciousness returned, I was lying on something flat and cold, a surface so smooth it felt almost liquid, yet completely solid. The air was different, sterile, and filled with a low, pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate not just in my ears, but through my entire skeleton. Opening my eyes was difficult, as if my eyelids weighed 100 pounds each. When I finally managed, what I saw made no sense. The room, if you could call it that, had no corners. The walls, floor, and ceiling curved into each other in a way that my mind struggled to process. Everything was a dull metallic gray that somehow emitted its own soft light. There were no visible lamps or windows, yet I could see perfectly. Most disturbing of all, my wound had stopped bleeding, though it remained open, the flesh around it numb and slightly discolored. I tried to sit up, but found that while I could move, my coordination was off, as if my brain and muscles were communicating through a faulty telephone line. That's when I noticed them watching me from the other side of the room. I can only describe them as shadows, with substance. 3 figures stood observing me, their bodies tall and impossibly thin, like stretched human silhouettes. In the decades since, I've heard people describe alien greys with large eyes, but these weren't like that at all. These beings had no distinguishable features I could recognize as a face, just smooth, oval-shaped heads with slight indentations where eyes should be. Their skin, if you could call it that, absorbed light rather than reflected it, creating a visual distortion around their forms, as if they were holes cut into reality itself. They didn't move like living creatures. They glided, maintaining perfect posture, their limbs never swinging or bending in natural ways. When they communicated, it wasn't through sounds, but through sensations in my mind, not quite voices or words, but concepts and emotions that formed in my thoughts as if they'd always been there. My training as a soldier had prepared me for many horrors. I'd seen men torn apart by artillery, witnessed the yellow clouds of mustard gas rolling across no man's land, held friends as they choked on their own blood. But nothing had prepared me for this violation of everything I understood about the world. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I felt a response inside my head. Curiosity, examination, study. They were studying me, like scientists might study an insect, with clinical detachment yet focused interest. Somehow, this emotionless scrutiny terrified me more than any hatred or aggression could have. Time lost all meaning in that place. Without the sun or stars, without clocks or the natural rhythm of day and night, I couldn't tell if hours or days were passing. The beings performed what I can only describe as examinations. They never physically touched me. Instead, objects emerged from the walls and floor, metallic instruments that moved with deliberate precision. One device scanned my body with a thin red beam that left a tingling sensation on my skin. Another hovered over my wounded shoulder, and I watched in horrified fascination as the shrapnel rose from my flesh of its own accord, suspended in air before being whisked away into a small opening in the wall. The wound itself began to close, not healing naturally, but almost melting back together. Throughout these procedures, I experienced their thoughts inserting themselves into mine, clinical observations, adjustments, calculations. They seemed particularly interested in my memories of the war, and I would suddenly find myself reliving specific moments from the trenches with such vivid detail that I could smell the putrid mud and gunpowder. One memory they returned to repeatedly was from Verdun in 1916, when our unit was caught in a week-long artillery bombardment that drove several men to madness. They seemed fascinated by our capacity for both inflicting and enduring suffering, probing these memories until I was silently weeping, trapped in the psychological torture of reliving the worst moments of my life over and over. When they finally withdrew from my mind, I felt hollow, as if pieces of my very soul had been extracted along with the memories. At some point during this ordeal, the environment around me changed. The walls of the room, which had been featureless except for the occasional emergence of examination equipment, began to display images. At first I thought they were windows that had suddenly appeared, but I quickly realized they were more like moving photographs projected onto the metal surfaces. I saw landscapes I recognized. Paris with the Eiffel Tower, the French countryside, the battlefields of the Western Front. But then the images shifted to places I'd never seen. Cities with impossible architecture, buildings that seemed to defy gravity, vehicles that moved without horses or visible engines. With a sickening realization, I understood they were showing me the future. I saw monstrous flying machines dropping objects on cities that erupted into fireballs larger than any artillery could create. I saw men in strange uniforms fighting across foreign landscapes, weapons that fired continuously without reloading, enormous metal vehicles crushing everything in their paths. It was another war, but with destructive power that dwarfed even the hell I had experienced. One of the beings approached as these visions played out around me. It extended a limb, not quite an arm, but a narrowing extension of its body, and for the first time made contact with me, placing what might have been a hand against my forehead. The touch was cold and sent electric shocks through my brain. In that moment, knowledge poured into me. Languages I'd never heard, concepts I couldn't fully comprehend, mathematics beyond my education, and glimpses of history that hadn't yet occurred. The information was too much, too fast, and I felt blood trickling from my nose and ears as my mind struggled to process it all. I screamed then, a primal sound that echoed strangely in that curved metallic chamber, and mercifully, darkness claimed me once again. When I regained consciousness, I was lying face down in damp grass. My first coherent thought was that I must have survived the German offensive and been moved to a field hospital's recovery area. The air smelled clean. No cordite, no rotting bodies, no lingering chemical weapons. For a moment, I felt profound relief. Then I opened my eyes and realized something was terribly wrong. I was in a small clearing surrounded by trees I didn't recognize, wearing my uniform that was still caked with battlefield mud, but with my wound completely healed, leaving only a strange, smooth scar, unlike any I'd seen from conventional medical treatment. My rifle lay beside me, along with my helmet and pack, everything exactly as it had been during the battle, yet impossibly clean of blood. The quality of light around me seemed different somehow, brighter, with colors that appeared slightly wrong, as if everything had been shifted a few degrees from reality as I understood it. When I managed to stand, my muscles felt simultaneously weak and hypersensitive, responding too quickly to my commands. My watch had stopped at 8:17, the exact moment of the artillery strike that had preceded my abduction. I stumbled through the woods, disoriented and desperate to find my unit or any sign of military activity. Instead, I emerged onto a paved road unlike any I'd seen before. Smooth black material without cobblestones or brick. In the distance, I could see buildings of a small village that seemed vaguely familiar, yet wrong in subtle ways. As I approached, I noticed strange poles with wires connecting them and metal contraptions moving at incredible speeds along the road, carrying people inside them without horses to pull them. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, trying to fit these observations into some framework I could understand. Was this an elaborate German psychological operation? Had I been captured and drugged? Was I still unconscious in some field hospital, hallucinating from morphine? A young boy on an odd two-wheeled contraption was the first to notice me. He stopped suddenly, staring with wide eyes at my uniform before pedaling away frantically toward the village. Within minutes, several adults appeared, keeping a cautious distance and speaking rapidly to each other in French. Thank God, at least the language was familiar, though their accents and some vocabulary seemed strange. They were dressed in clothing I didn't recognize, the men wearing colorful short-sleeved shirts and tight blue trousers, the women in scandalously short dresses that showed their knees and calves. One man approached, introducing himself as the village mayor. When I identified myself as Corporal Jean Moreau of the 151st Infantry Regiment and asked where my unit might be stationed, his face paled. He asked what year I thought it was. 1918, I answered, irritated by the absurd question. His response, that it was July 1968, felt like another artillery shell exploding next to me. 50 years. Half a century gone in what had felt like hours to me. I collapsed to my knees, vomiting violently onto the strange, smooth road as the implications crashed through my mind. Everyone I knew, my parents, my sweetheart Marie, my comrades, would be elderly or dead. The war that had consumed my entire adult life was now distant history. The mayor must have seen the shock and disbelief in my eyes, because he gently helped me to my feet and led me to the village's small cafe, speaking softly as one might to a frightened animal. Inside, a strange box with moving pictures and sound sat in the corner. People gathered around it, watching scenes from another place. The sight of this technology, which I would later learn was called television, triggered flashes of memory from the metal room. The images the beings had shown, me of the future, my future, which was now somehow the present. The next days passed in a blur of confusion and invasive questioning. Government officials arrived within hours. How they were notified so quickly, I still don't know. They brought doctors who examined me thoroughly, drawing blood, taking photographs, with advanced cameras, and subjecting me to machines that could somehow see inside my body without cutting me open. They confirmed through records and fingerprints that I was indeed Jean Moreau, born in 1895, enlisted in 1914, and listed as missing in action, presumed dead, on March 14th, 1918. My knowledge of military protocols, historical details about the war, and personal information about my commanding officers convinced them I wasn't an imposter. Yet my apparent age and the impossibility of my story left them visibly disturbed. When I described the metal room and the shadow beings, the officials exchanged glances I couldn't interpret. One doctor suggested I was suffering from traumatic amnesia and had invented an elaborate delusion to explain the gap in my memory. But that didn't explain my youthful appearance or the strange scar where my shrapnel wound had been. Another theory they proposed was even more insulting, that I was the son or grandson of the original Jean Moreau, perpetrating some bizarre hoax. But again, my fingerprints disproved this. Eventually they settled on a narrative of special government research that had gone classified, suggesting I had been part of an experimental program during the war that had somehow preserved me. This was their public explanation, though in private conversations I overheard, their theories were far more disturbing. One official whispered about returning abductees and temporal displacement, while another mentioned similar cases they had documented since the Roswell incident, whatever that was. Through it all, I noticed they kept me isolated from newspapers and limited my exposure to television, carefully controlling what information I received about the world I had returned to. After weeks of interrogations and examinations, the officials determined I wasn't an immediate security threat and placed me in a rehabilitation program designed to acclimate me to modern society. They provided me with a small apartment in Paris, a modest stipend from what they called veterans' benefits, and weekly sessions with a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma cases. The world of 1968 was overwhelming. The noise, the speed, the crowds of people constantly in motion. Everything moved too quickly for my mind to process. The first time I saw an airplane up close, I had a panic attack so severe they had to sedate me. It wasn't just the technology that was disorienting, it was the fundamental shift in social reality. Women wore pants and smoked publicly. Young people gathered in streets protesting against the government, something that would have been harshly suppressed in my time. Music blared from devices in shops and cafes, chaotic and discordant to my ears. Colors seemed artificially bright. Clothing, advertisements, even food packaging assaulted my senses with their garish hues. My nightmares were relentless. In them, I would find myself back in the metal room, but the shadow beings would wear the faces of the government officials and doctors who'd interrogated me. Sometimes in these dreams, they would peel back their skin to reveal the darkness underneath, confirming what I already suspected, that humans were working with these entities, perhaps had been for decades. Other nights, I dreamed of the battlefield, but with a horrifying twist. All the dead soldiers would have my face, as if copies of myself had been sent back to die in various ways, while the real me was kept preserved elsewhere. The psychiatrist said these were manifestations of my survivor's guilt and temporal displacement confusion. But I knew they were memories trying to surface, fragments of truth my conscious mind couldn't fully access. The most disturbing aspects of my return weren't the technological advancements or cultural changes, but the physiological anomalies I began to notice in myself. My vision would occasionally shift, allowing me to see spectrums of light that shouldn't be visible to human eyes. Ultraviolet patterns on flowers, infrared heat signatures emanating from people and machines. These episodes would last anywhere from minutes to hours before fading back to normal sight. My hearing similarly became hypersensitive at random intervals. I could detect conversations from across crowded rooms, the electrical hum of wiring in walls, even the ultrasonic clicks of bats flying at night. These sensory changes were accompanied by splitting headaches and nosebleeds, similar to what I'd experienced when the being had touched my forehead and flooded my mind with information. Most concerningly, I began finding small, perfectly circular scars appearing on my body that I had no memory of receiving. Behind my ears, along my spine, at the base of my skull. The doctors documented these marks but offered no explanation, beyond possible psychosomatic manifestations or suggesting I was inflicting them on myself unconsciously. I know better. They're monitoring devices or implants of some kind. Sometimes at night, I feel them activating, a slight vibration or warming sensation, as if transmitting data to somewhere far away. The most compelling evidence that something fundamentally changed in me came 6 months after my return, when I accidentally cut my hand while cooking. The wound, which should have required stitches, sealed itself within hours, leaving no scar. I didn't report this to the doctors or government handlers. Some instinct, perhaps implanted by the beings themselves, warned me to keep certain things secret, that revealing too much would result in permanent confinement in some government facility where I would become nothing more than a specimen, to be studied, just as the shadow beings had studied me. I tried to find information about similar cases, others who might have experienced what I had, but this proved nearly impossible. The officials had strictly limited my access to newspapers and libraries, claiming it was to prevent information overload during my adjustment period. When I did manage to visit a public library and asked for materials about unexplained disappearances or returned missing persons, the librarian's initially helpful demeanor changed after she made a phone call regarding my request. Within 20 minutes, one of my government handlers arrived to escort me home, claiming I was having an episode. After that, my movements were more closely monitored. I began to notice men in nondescript clothing watching my apartment from parked cars. My telephone line had a distinct click and occasional echo that hadn't been there before. Once I found my apartment subtly disturbed upon returning from a therapy session. Items moved slightly from their original positions, as if someone had searched the place. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my situation. Everyone I had known and loved was gone. My parents had died in the 1940s. Marie had married a British soldier in 1920 and moved to London, where she passed away in 1967, just months before my return. The bitter irony of missing her by so little time haunted me. My younger brother Philippe had survived the war only to die in the next one, falling during the German invasion of 1940. I visited their graves, standing before the cold stones that represented the lives I should have shared but didn't. But at Philippe's grave, I experienced the surreal horror of seeing my own birth year on his headstone. We were born only 2 years apart, yet he had lived a complete life and died an old man while I remained trapped in my 20s. The cemetery caretaker assumed I was a grandson paying respects, and I lacked the energy to correct him. What would be the point? The truth was too impossible, too horrifying for casual conversation. Yes, I'm visiting my brother's grave. He was 72 when he died, but I'm his older brother. I'm 23. I've been away, you see, in a metal room beyond comprehension, while my family lived and died without me. Despite the surveillance, I found ways to research my condition. I befriended an elderly professor of physics who was intrigued by my theoretical questions about time dilation and dimensional travel. Without revealing my true circumstances, I described hypothetical scenarios that mirrored my experience. His explanations involved concepts like Einstein-Rosen bridges, temporal displacement fields, and non-linear time perception, terms that resonated with strange familiarity, as if they'd been part of the knowledge downloaded into my mind. During the abduction, the professor introduced me to scientific journals and books that weren't on my handler's approved reading list. These materials contained theories that aligned disturbingly well with my experience, discussions of advanced civilizations that might use gravity manipulation as a method of transport, entities that could exist in higher dimensions, making them appear as shadowy or partial projections in our three-dimensional space. Most significantly, I discovered accounts of strange aerial phenomena reported by military pilots during both world wars. The descriptions matched what I had seen before my abduction. The unnatural stillness, the blue-tinted light, the sensation of time stopping around a specific area. These reports had been systematically dismissed or classified by military authorities, creating a pattern of denial that extended decades. One night, after reading a particularly relevant account from a RAF pilot in 1943, I experienced a sudden, excruciating headache followed by a flood of previously inaccessible memories. I remembered more details from the metal room, specifically maps or star charts that had appeared on the walls, showing our solar system and what seemed to be travel routes extending to a star system I now recognized as Zeta Reticuli from my astronomical reading. I remembered the beings communicating that humans were part of a long-term study, that individuals were selected from various time periods, particularly during conflicts, when their disappearances would be attributed to combat casualties. Most disturbingly, I recalled one entity conveying that I was not being returned to my original timeline, but to a control point in what they considered the optimal observation period for pre-integration phase humans. The implication that our entire civilization was being monitored toward some ultimate purpose made me physically ill. The incidents began increasing in frequency about a year after my return. I would experience periods of missing time, entering my apartment in the evening only to suddenly find it was past midnight, with no memory of the intervening hours. Objects in my home would relocate themselves, not dramatic movements, but subtle repositioning that I might have attributed to forgetfulness. If not for the precision and consistency of the placements, electronic devices near me would malfunction, radios changing stations, telephone calls dropping, streetlights flickering as I walked beneath them. One evening, I returned home to find every clock in my apartment displaying the exact time, 8:17, the moment of my original abduction in 1918. When I attempted to reset them, they would revert to that time within minutes. I reported none of this to my handlers or doctors, knowing it would only result in increased surveillance or possibly institutionalization. Instead, I started keeping detailed journals, writing in a code I had developed based on a mixture of military ciphers from my era and mathematical concepts I had somehow acquired during my abduction. The most terrifying incident occurred during the summer of 1969. The television had been broadcasting something about Americans landing on the moon, an achievement that should have astounded me, but that I accepted with numb recognition, having already seen far more advanced technology. As I watched the grainy images of astronauts bouncing across the lunar surface, my apartment was suddenly bathed in the familiar blue light. Everything around me slowed. The dust particles in the air froze in place. The ticking of my clock stopped. Even the sound from the television stretched into an elongated drone. In the reflection of my window, I saw them standing behind me. The same shadow beings from the metal room, observing me in my apartment as if it were another laboratory. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch in the reflection as one approached and placed its appendage on my head just as before. But this time, instead of information flowing in, I sensed it extracting data, reviewing my memories of adaptation, my emotional responses, my attempts to research my condition. It was collecting the results of its experiment. After what seemed like hours but was likely only seconds, the blue light faded. Time resumed its normal flow, and I collapsed to the floor, blood streaming from my nose and ears. The following morning, I discovered a perfect circular scar at the base of my skull that hadn't been there before. That was 1 year ago, and I haven't experienced any further direct interaction since then. But I know they're still watching. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in reflective surfaces, not physical presences, but something like after images or projections from another dimension that intersects briefly with ours. The knowledge they placed in my mind continues to surface unpredictably. Last week, I found myself unconsciously drawing schematics for a device that appears to be some form of quantum communication system. I understand the principles behind it without knowing how I acquired this understanding. I've hidden these drawings along with my journals. If anything happens to me, at least some record of the truth might survive. I'm sharing this account now because I've recently discovered evidence suggesting I'm not alone in this experience. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, I've identified 3 other individuals with stories disturbingly similar to mine. People who disappeared during conflicts, the Second World War, Korea, and most recently Vietnam, only to reappear decades later, unaged and disoriented. 1. A former Navy pilot who vanished in 1944 over the Pacific reappeared in 1965 with the same physiological anomalies I experience. We've established a cautious correspondence through encrypted messages in classified advertisements, sharing observations and theories. He believes, as I've come to, that we're part of an ongoing program of observation and experimentation by entities that exist beyond our conventional understanding of time and space. Entities that have likely been monitoring human development for thousands of years, occasionally extracting specimens for closer study before returning them to different points in time to observe their reintegration. The most chilling pattern we've identified is that each of us reappeared approximately 50 years after our disappearance, and each of us has experienced exactly 1 follow-up visit since our return. If the pattern holds, there will be more like us emerging soon, traumatized anachronisms dropped into a world we no longer understand. I write this account not expecting to be believed by the general public, but in hopes it might reach others like me who need to know they aren't alone or insane. And perhaps as a warning, when the blue light comes, when time stops around you, and the air shivers with impossible energy, you are being selected. For what ultimate purpose I still don't know, but I am certain of one thing. They will come back for us eventually. The extractions, examinations, and observations are building toward something. The beings see our wars, our technological development, our social structures as data points in some vast experiment nearing its conclusion. And I fear that when they've gathered enough information, when they've completed whatever calculations they're making about our species, the next phase won't involve returning us at all. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey.